Now the U.S. has deployed its troops to Poland as part of a large-scale military buildup near the border with Russia. There's the first batch of American soldiers dispatched to Poland since the end of the Cold War back in the early 1990s. The deployment brings to more than 3,000 number of American troops in the East European country. Moves drawn immediate reaction from Russia, with the Kremlin slamming it as a threat at its doorstep. The U.S. Troop deployment is part of NATO's eastward expansion, which was stepped up back in 2014 after Crimea rejoined Russia. Now, Moscow has been a strong opponent of troop deployments by a Western alliance in Eastern Europe, saying it's meant to encircle Russia. And now we're joined by Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol. Hello there, Mr. Gosling, and thanks for joining us on the program again, sir. Now, how warranted is Russia's concerns here?
Well, of course they're warranted. You just pointed out 2014 was the year that things started to change, and that the Americans decided they wanted to put a lot more troops and also have a much bigger presence with the missile defense system. Missile defense system is effectively a kind of thing that caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they're being very provocative, and that happened the minute somebody, that is the people of Crimea, were actually asked, do you want NATO to be expanding into your country? And of course they said no. Look, this really all goes back to 1990 and the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which of course was the end of the Soviet Union. At the time it was Edward Shevardnadze for the Russians and James Baker for the United States negotiating what was happening at that time. And absolute promises were made by NATO, by James Baker, etc., that NATO is not looking at all, promised faithfully not to be expanding eastwards. Now, what we've seen ever since is an expanding eastwards into Poland, into Hungary, into the Czech Republic, into the Baltic states, Latvia and Lithuania. So the Americans have broken their word. And we just heard, didn't we, from the new Defense Secretary, General Mattis, about this idea that the Russians, Vladimir Putin, it's always personalized to Putin, are trying to break NATO. I'll tell you who's trying to break NATO. That's the Americans and the Pentagon. They've been doing these regime change actions all around the Middle East, and they've also done a coup in Ukraine in order to get the Ukrainians onto the more pro-NATO side and away from Russia. They've also been organizing, many people now believe, an attempted coup in Turkey. If you're in an alliance called NATO, and Turkey's in that alliance too, don't you think the best way to break up that alliance is to organise an attempted coup in one of your so-called alliance friends? So that effectively, I think, is what's really going on here. And it's an absolutely disgusting thing to see, the very last days of the Obama administration, with these thousands of tanks being moved into right up to the Russian border, and also thousands of troops being shipped over, and more tanks over from the United States into Europe, and it's an extreme provocation. Let's hope that Trump immediately reverses these decisions, but with what Mattis has been saying, maybe he won't.
And in all fairness, and to be frank, I mean, it begs the question, how will the U.S. respond or react to a military alliance led by Russia piling up on the U.S.-Mexico border facing the U.S.?
Well, or in Canada, somewhere like that. You know, if you had 2,000 tanks, Russian tanks, being shipped or flown across the Arctic and put on the border in Canada. Look, yes, of course, the Americans would go ballistic in that sort of situation. Yeah, I think this is a provocation for war, World War III, effectively, and it's the last blast of the previous administration. I don't know if Trump is going to be able to stop it. I think we all just need to be aware that there is this financial crash looming. We had a bailout in 2008. It wasn't a crash, it was a bailout, and we haven't really done anything to really fix the economy. The economies in the United States and Europe have been on this kind of heroin injection of fake money, this quantitative easing money, and so we're in a very fragile situation. There's also big questions about criminality in the banking system, and here in Britain with the VIP pedophile scandal. So there will be some people amongst the criminal elite that that won't actually mind if there's a war. I mean, most of us, of course, think this is a terrible thing. Nobody wants war. But actually, you'll find there are people that make a lot of money out of war. And also there are criminals that want to distract attention away from the domestic situation in their own countries.
Thank you much for your contribution, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol.